Now, did you know that last week, an ex-Army veteran from California was arrested for driving to Detroit's largest mosque with a trunk full of explosives? Roger Stockham, 63, had driven from California to Michigan and had been drinking in a Detroit bar on Monday when he threatened to do harm to a Detroit area mosque. And a bar employee followed the man outside, wrote down his license plate, and called Detroit police. Police then found the man inside of his car outside the Islamic Center of America, where more than 500 members were gathered for a funeral. And in his car, he had a load of M80s and other explosives in the trunk. Now, whatever damage he was planning was averted, thanks to authorities. But the mainstream media has completely ignored this story. Now, just imagine if the same thing had happened, but the perpetrator was a Muslim man. His mugshot would be on every TV screen, every hour. So what does that tell you about our media culture? Well, joining me to discuss it is Georgetown University professor and author of the blog Nat Turner's Revenge, Christopher Chambers. Chris, thanks so much for being here. Now, are you with me on this one? Because, you know, we've had a lot of these, you know, terror plots that have been foiled recently in the last couple months, over the last year. And we've seen a lot of those mugshots plastered on our TVs, where the news talks about it day and night, nonstop. And here, nothing. But do you think that if he were a Muslim man that were outside of a church that had 500 people inside, it would be a different situation?
Oh, I think so. I mean, but it can't, it's a lot more complicated than just saying racism or anti-Muslim bias, because our media is set up, whether you're talking about local TV stations in Michigan or wherever, or national satellite, you know, and cable networks, for the quick hit, quick segment, stereotypical kind of setup, because it plays on our fears of outside Muslim terrorism, or even better, the enemy within, this so-called radicalization of American Muslims that hasn't been proven. Yes, you've had these, you know, these examples, you know, in Oregon and Major Nadal at Fort Hood. But by and large, when they've done polling, and even the FBI is, you know, when they do their little background of American Muslims, people are content, people are patriotic, people are just trying to survive. But that doesn't fit into the production mode of our American media that plays on fear. Otherwise, it becomes, you know, a crime story. It's an older white male, you know, he's part of our community. If it's a young Somali man, he's outside of the community. And what's ironic is this mosque is one of the largest in America. There have been Middle Eastern people, Arabs, Christian Druze, in Detroit for eons. I mean, you can't tell them apart from the average Detroiter. So they're even thought of as outside of the American fold. So, I mean, why isn't there more coverage? Well, they're still Muslims. Even though they've been in Detroit forever and have Michigan accents, they're still Muslims, so we don't cover them as carefully. Well,
I also think it says a lot about our politicians, our lawmakers that are also incredibly outspoken, whom we've heard a lot from. We have people like Representative Peter King, who is now going to hold hearings on the radicalization of Islam. But, you know, we don't have any hearings on just homegrown terrorism as a whole, on the radicalization of other people. This man, for example, the suspect here, had made threats to George W. Bush in the past, death threats. You know, he had written online using a fake Muslim name. I thought they were, you know, monitoring all people when it came to this.
Well, there's interesting in the movie The Town, John Hamm, who's a federal agent, is monitoring Ben Affleck and these bank robbers. And he's saying, if they would convert to Islam, I could get 24-hour surveillance on them. But no, but then they're just regular criminals. He's just a regular lunatic. Regular lunatics are not sexy. They're not, you know, and you have to assign some research and some thought in a production meeting or an editorial meeting to figure out what makes him tick. If he was a young Somali man, we can hit on the stereotypes. We don't need to go into any depth. We can play on the outside fear. Peter King can have his hearings, and they're not going to really say anything. They're not going to find anything. But it plays on fear. Fear sells. That's what they talk about in the production meeting and the editorial meetings. I mean, it's as simple as that, really.
And the authorities, I think, are well aware of that as well, because, you know, when we had some of these sting operations, like in Colorado, for example, this is something that the authorities were more than happy to brag about. Here's a man who was arrested a week ago last Monday.
Right.
They didn't even bother telling anybody about it until Friday.
Right. And the people in the mosque were sitting there going, well, who's the next lunatic that's going to come along? I mean, and you know, you can relate this to the coverage in Tucson, and then the entire media rigmarole about, well, is it incited by the political climate, or is this the lone lunatic? I mean, of course the environment has an effect on people like this. It sets them off on some level, and they go from California to Detroit to putatively blow Muslims up.
And, you know, and we've also spoken about this before in the sense that the media, if something is a little too complicated, they also just like to drop it.
Right.
We've spoken about the really embarrassing coverage of the Iraq War that only made up 4% of coverage last year. And, you know, even if you look at the bombings in Moscow last Monday, the Mediaevo airport, I mean, granted, yes, there's a revolution happening in Egypt, so a lot of the media has been focusing on that. But I didn't hear anything about Moscow after one day. Right,
because it becomes a crime story, and that interests some people, but ironically it becomes so mundane. Crime stories become so mundane that they just sail over our heads. But here we have fear, we have outsiders, or the enemy within. We're talking about Muslims, either local or across the ocean. That makes it sexy. That means you can be a little lazy on your coverage in terms of the production, in terms of the research, but then you saturate the news with it. So when I mean lazy in terms of the production, I mean you don't have to put any thought into it. You can blast those stereotypes out. Everybody gets scared, you get the ratings. This crime stories are a little bit more complicated, a little bit more boring, ironically.
Now, very quickly, I just had a discussion on the New York Times coming up with a paywall soon. Yes or no? Do you think that it's actually going to work for them?
I think it's going to work. People want the content. It's going to work. I mean, the average person, with net neutrality, the net is being cut up for rich and poor people anyway. Rich people are going to pay for it. The poor people are going to be cut out.
Well, we will see what happens. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.